All right, so let me introduce you to the subject matter with which we are going to be concerning ourselves for the next several weeks. You are looking at the right upper limb of a human. You're looking at real skeletal remains. This is a vintage articulated skeleton. During the drawing portions of this course, I'm not going to use these real skeletons because they're much too delicate, especially if they're a little bit older. I'll be using castings instead. As I mentioned before, the human body is best understood by starting with the skeleton. I'll take a moment to introduce you to each of the individual bones. The first bone we're going to be studying, and at this angle, it's not the best way to appreciate this bone, but I'll bring this out separately in a moment, so don't worry. But we're going to be starting with the scapula and then moving on to the clavicle. Now, these two bones together make up the shoulder girdle, or the pectoral girdle, or the forelimb girdle. Those are all names for the same thing. Next, we have the humerus, which is this long, heavy bone. The humerus is the bone of the arm. I'll take a moment to describe what I mean by that, because you might say, oh, there's many bones of the arm. I'll explain what I mean in just a moment here. Next, we have the ulna and the radius. The ulna makes up your elbow. So if you feel your elbow right now, like I'm doing right now, you're actually feeling this bone through the surface. This bone is the radius. It's so named because it radiates, it rotates along an axis. And this allows us to do pronation and supination. This is supination. So if I were to hold a bowl of soup in my hand, I would be supinated. That's the way to remember it. Next, we have the carpal bones, which we're going to learn about. These are the bones of the wrist. These longer bones, articulating with them, are called the metacarpals, meta beyond the carpal bones. Those bones are basically making up the palm of our hand. And connecting to the metacarpals are the phalanges. The thumb has 2 phalanges. The rest of the fingers actually have 3 phalanges each, as you can see. These are the bones we're going to be studying, and in that order. But I want to take a minute because you might have noticed that I said upper limb, and you might have found that strange. So let me just explain something. There are colloquial terms that everyday people who are not trained in anatomy use. Colloquially, this is all the arm. But in anatomy, only this section here, which is comprised of the humerus, is the arm. This is the shoulder girdle. This is the arm. This section is the forearm. And of course, this is the hand. So we're going to make those distinctions when necessary, but I just want to call your attention to that. Now that we have a general overview of the upper limb in the human, let's talk about the first bone we're going to be starting with, which is the scapula. Here we have a right scapula. This is also a human bone. This is not the same scapula we just saw in the articulated arm. This is a different individual. We are going to become very familiar and very intimate with all of the forms that you can see here. Maybe the first thing that you notice about the scapula is that we can see this black background through the scapula. If we were to hold this up to the light, we would notice that we can actually see through it. It is somewhat transparent. That is because the actual body of the bone is very, very light. Normally when castings are made, so if you were to buy a skeleton, a plastic casting of a skeleton, they have to thicken this up. They have to change the actual shape in the mold making process because this would just crack and break. That's why I'm going to be using a casting when I'm doing the drawing proper, because I can't prevent this from getting chipped. It's a relatively large bone. It is a triangular bone, just like this. It's made of 3 borders. So this border right here is the medial border. It's also known as the vertebral border. This border right here is the lateral border, or the axillary border. And this border up above, this way, is the superior border. And so where these sides come together, so in this case, we have the medial border joining the superior border, we have what's called an angle. So this is the superior angle of the scapula. Similarly, if we come down, this is the lateral border or axillary border, and it's joining The medial border, or the vertebral border, where those come together, is the inferior angle. So superior means higher up, inferior means lower down. So where the superior angle and the lateral angle come together is actually a joint. This is called the glenoid fossa, or the glenoid cavity. If we remember from our last scene, this is what receives the humerus. The head of the humerus articulates here with this shallow cavity. This is also known as the head of the bone, and then where it gets thinner or narrower underneath is known as the neck of the bone. So one way of talking about the bone is to say that this is the head, and then all of this is the body, and then this area would be the neck. Thinking of it as a triangle helps us to remember the different borders. Okay, if there's a superior border, why isn't there an inferior border? Because it's a triangle. There's not an edge going this way. So lateral, superior, medial borders. Besides the fact that the scapula is overall a triangular shape, the next thing that you might notice is that it is concave on one side. Concave, think of a cave. It means that it dips in on one side. On the other side, it is overall convex. We can see that here. So it is convex on this side, concave on the other side. So if you're thinking of the scapula as just something that is on the back, we need to improve that understanding. It is not a static thing. It is not like an action figure where there is one joint, or a wooden mannequin where there is one joint that represents the shoulder. This bone, as we're going to learn, is moving all over the curved surface of the back of the rib cage. So this surface is also known as the costal surface. Costal means rib. So this is the costal surface, and it's curved so that it can slide over the rounded surface. Now, the other surface is dominated by this spine that you see. This is the spine of the scapula. This is very important for us as artists because this separates groups of muscles, and it's relatively close to the surface of the body. So the medial border here and the spine of the scapula, including this outcropping, which is called the acromion process, these are particularly important elements for us to understand and be able to recognize in the body. So from here to here to here, very important areas. The glenoid fossa, which is where the humerus attaches, is very important as well. So you have an incredibly mobile support system, and then from that is where the humerus is articulating. It's really important to understand not only the shape, the size, the dimensions of the scapula and the clavicle, but where these joints are and what is the range of motion and where is that humerus going to begin so that you can depict the rest of the arm, so that you can build the rest of the arm. Let's talk about the features of the scapula. This side right here is the costal side. You could also think of this as the anterior side. This is also the ventral side. Those are all names for the same thing. This side is concave, as we mentioned. We have, again, the medial border, the superior border. Now right here, now this is slightly damaged. I mentioned how delicate real bones are, so this is slightly chipped. We have this little notch. This is known as the scapular notch or the suprascapular notch, meaning above. It's a notch on the top of the scapula, suprascapular notch. There's actually a ligament that runs here, and in some scapulae you might see, let's say you see a real scapula, you see a photograph from a dissection, sometimes this will become a foramen or a hole. The ligament will ossify and it will fuse. But this is the more typical orientation. It's just a little notch here. So at the end of this notch, we have what's called the coracoid process. That is this finger. It's like a finger that juts out into space. The name derives from the word for raven. And if you look at it from some angles, the coracoid process looks like a raven's head. On some scapulae, that is actually more noticeable than on others. The coracoid process is a really important jutting, rugose, meaning it is rugged, it is rough, appendage that receives many attachments, many important ligament and muscular attachments, which we will learn about. Among others, this is where one of the heads of the biceps connects. It's also where the coracobrachialis connects, and we'll learn more about that. So this is jutting out into space. So as we come down from the coracoid process, we see the glenoid fossa. Now the glenoid fossa is pear-shaped. I always think of it sort of as like a soy sauce dish. It's very shallow. The fact that it's shallow is important and it's relevant because the head of the humerus is quite round, and this is such a shallow joint, which means there's an enormous amount of movement possible because you have this shallow socket and this round hemisphere of the head of the humerus. And so this makes it the most mobile joint in the body. It's also easier to dislocate as opposed to the hip joint, for example, in which the acetabulum, the part of the pelvis which is analogous to this, is deeper, and so it's a more secure connection. At the top of the glenoid fossa here is what is called the supraglenoid tubercle. The supraglenoid tubercle is going to be important for muscular attachments. We're going to talk about that. It's where the other head of biceps attaches. And then below is the infraglenoid tubercle. And that is where, through the glenoid labrum, which is a structure we're going to learn about, that is where the long head of triceps attaches. So one head of biceps is attaching up here, one head of triceps is attaching here, the other head of the biceps is attaching here, and the coracobrachialis is attaching here. When it comes to the origins and insertions and muscular attachments, we are going to learn all that in great detail. That's not something that you need to memorize now. I'm just giving you some idea why the bones are shaped the way they are, because as we will see again and again, the bones shape the muscles and the muscles shape the bones. They're not static objects. They're living tissues that are reacting to their environment. This concave side, well, there's a muscle in here, a large muscle. It's complex. It has many parts. It's called subscapularis. Sub means under. So if we're looking at the body from this direction, underneath, that is the surface. So it's subscapularis. It is actually going to be attaching to the humerus. It helps to rotate the humerus towards itself. That's all muscles do. They pull their origin insertion points closer together. That's their only function. Subscapularis has these intramuscular tendons. So there are tendons within the muscle that are grabbing onto the bone. Those cause these ridges. These are called oblique ridges. Now, on a bigger, heavier scapula where the person probably had thicker, heavier muscles, you're going to get a rougher texture there. You're going to get more of a ridge. And on some scapulae, from very slight people that are thinner, smaller, less muscle mass, these can actually almost disappear. So that's what these ridges are. These are the oblique ridges. Now, down at the bottom here, we have a very thick rugose area, and that area is very important, as we're going to see. This is where serratus anterior attaches, and also all up along this medial border on the costal side is where serratus anterior is attaching. Serratus anterior is a saw-like muscle that fans out and grabs onto the rib cage, and it's one of the rotators of the scapula. The serratus anterior pulls the scapula towards the rib cage in this direction, whereas the trapezius is going to pull the scapula in sort of the opposite direction, or at least this part of the trapezius, the upper part of trapezius. One thing you might have noticed is that the lateral border is much thicker. We have like this bar right here that makes its way all the way from the head of the scapula down to the inferior angle. And these always remind me of like plants, trees. You'll notice that with bones, they grow in this way that reminds you of like tree trunks growing. And so this is like a very thickened, this is a quite thickened area. This is called a sulcus. I think of it as like a trough. It is sort of a concave area, if I can show that clearly. So while it's very thick here, it's quite thin and relatively straight on the medial border. There's a big difference there. On this side, it's much thicker. The actual lateral border itself can be quite thin and quite sharp, but overall we've got a thick cortex. And we'll notice this, that often this sort of reminds you of like a leaf pattern, you know, where these are the separations. We will often notice that this growth, so if you think of this like some kind of plant or a tree trunk or something, it will cause bumps. It will cause projections on the outer contours, which are typically the outlines when we're drawing them. So you can see that here with the spine of the scapula. It sort of, as it ends, creates this growth. And that has to do with the natural growing pattern. And so when we think about gesture, gesture is not just something that applies to the overall figure. There's gesture in every bone. There's gesture in every muscle. There's gesture in every structure of the living world. The same elements that we look for in a figure drawing or a figure study are the same elements we look at when we are studying the individual parts. The last thing we want to do is think of anatomy as a bunch of rigid, hard to remember, complex, academic facts that don't actually relate to the activity of doing art. So as much as possible, we want to look at these things with an artist's eye. We're being analytical, but we're also trying to see the beauty. We're trying to see the movement. We're trying to see the character. Let's go ahead and move along, and we'll switch over now to the dorsal side. Now on this side, again, here is the superior angle. The spine of the scapula, which is impossible to miss, it's this long projection here. The spine of the scapula separates the scapula into two parts, not two equal parts, but two parts. Everything below the spine is the infraspinous fossa. Infra meaning below, spinous meaning the spine, below the spine, fossa meaning that it is concave. Overall, this is the convex side, but if we get a little bit closer, we'll see that there's actually a concavity here, and that concavity and this entire area here that I'm touching right now is the infraspinous fossa. But you might have guessed, but above the spine, this is the supraspinous fossa. So all of this is the supraspinous fossa. Now you'll notice that on the infraspinous portion under here, this area is dug out or excavated deeper here on the medial side. I don't know if you can tell, but as I run my finger in here, I can fit my finger kind of snugly inside, whereas on the top, this is the shallow side, and it is actually deepest on the lateral side. That kind of reflection, the relation of opposites, the mirroring is interesting, and we see that all over. Like there's even a mirroring here. We've got this curve here, and then it's mirrored by this curve above. This is, on this scapula, this is jutting out a bit far. Normally it's more like covered like this. Typically this is a triangular plane, and this is quite important because the spine doesn't end at one point, although if you were to give it a point for the purposes of measuring, it would be here. There is quite a bit of distance here, so don't turn this into a single line and forget about this plane as we study it. Up here again, it is concave. There is this sort of, again, thinking about in terms of branches, there is this sort of branching out that happens here, and that branch sort of comes around and forms the superior angle. Underneath the spine, we see it's sort of like a column or a support that helps the spine. Now, the spine of the scapula is spiraling in several different ways. This surface right here is spiraling, so if I were to sort of approximate a normal, this surface is facing this way, this surface is facing this way, this surface is facing this way, and then up. Do you see that? So we're going from the medial posterior direction to a superior, slightly medial direction. And then if we come all the way out here on the acromion, it is superior and probably slightly lateral direction. That spiraling is happening here, but it's also happening on this underside as well. And we'll notice that there are quite a bit of spiraling forms. I mean, this is a spiraling form, as you can see here. Look at how that curves around. We'll often notice this in the scapula and in the bones in general. There's often spiraling forms. They're quite beautiful. This notch, this is the greater scapular notch. This notch allows a blood vessel and a nerve to pass through it, to pass from the supraspinous fossa to the infraspinous fossa. It creates sort of a channel. I find it very beautiful. So where does the scapula actually articulate or join? Where is the joint that connects this with the rest of the body? There is no bony attachment on any of this side. The only way that the scapula attaches to the rest of the skeleton is through the clavicle to the pit of the neck, to the sternum. There is no attachment here to the rib cage or to the spine or anything like that that is bony. What you have is a series of muscular slings that we're going to learn about. Just like if you can imagine your arm in a sling if it's injured, that's sort of how this is. It's hanging in these slings, and these slings are moving it about, but it's primarily muscles that it is suspended on and being moved about with. And the clavicle, which is a bony attachment, the clavicle actually does not connect. So you might imagine that just looking at the shape of the bone, it's a very common mistake to think that the clavicle attaches here or it attaches here, but it actually attaches to the anterior medial side. So anterior is front of the body, medial is towards the spine, towards the midline. So it's actually attaching here. This is where the clavicle articulates. And if you can see, there is often an articular facet here. In some scapulae, this can actually widen and become lipping. It can become more like the glenoid fossa in terms of it having this wasting that is moving around. There is a freedom of movement between the two bones that we're going to learn about. It is only articulating with the clavicle here and the head of the humerus here. So before we start studying this with the language of drawing, are there any other points that I might want to point out to you? Well, it is quite rough down here. This is where teres major attaches. So we have this roughened, wider area on both sides. Now the acromion itself, most often this is straighter. Sometimes it is curved. This one is slightly curved, but there's a lot of variety in this. It can be straight and rectangular. It can be curved. It can be irregular. It can be sickle shaped. It's relatively smooth on the underside and relatively rugose or rough on the top. Now that we've had an overview of this bone, let's move on. We are going to begin our first transformation, which is the term that the old masters used for what we're going to do. The idea here is that we are going to draw the scapula from different angles. So we're going to start with a dorsal view or posterior or rear view, as you can see here. And then we're going to do a lateral view, which is something like you see here. And then a costal, which refers to the ribs, the surface of the scapula that slides over or glides over the ribs via muscular slings that we will learn about. Or this is also would be the frontal view or the anterior view. We're also going to do a medial view. And we're going to see and draw the scapula from below as well as from above, a superior view. This kind of layout is probably making you think of architecture, engineering. It's used by those disciplines. This was used in the Renaissance. It was referred to as a transformation. These drawings that we're going to do in this way are orthographic, meaning that there is no convergence. There is no perspective distortion. In other words, the drawing is dimensional. There's a very good reason for this, and this is something we're going to explore and talk about as we move forward. We are going to take it one step at a time. So we're going to begin with this view, which again is the dorsal or posterior view. And to do this, we are going to use a rectangle or one face of a box, because we know that the scapula can be broken into 6 parts, where if we were to place this inside a rectangle, we would have 5 parts across and 6 parts up. We're going to begin by building a rectangle that has those dimensions. Now, we could just build a rectangle of any size on our paper. It depends on, the size of your page, or if you're using a sketchbook, the size of your sketchbook page. In my case, because of the size of the paper, because of the camera setup that I have and what is going to make the most sense for the illustration I want to do, I'm going to make one part. So if it's 5 by 6, I'm going to make each one of those parts is going to be 1 inch in my model. Now, I happen to have an architect's scale that is imperial. Obviously I'm in the United States. If another dimension made sense, let's say 2 centimeters, 1 centimeter, whatever it is, I would use that. So I do encourage you to try to find a unit that you can measure with a ruler or a scale or whatever you have that corresponds to these parts. You can also just freehand draw this, but the way that it's going to work, because we're carrying over, and you're going to see this as I progress, because we're carrying over measurements of the drawing from one aspect or angle to another, any mistake that's made is going to cause compounding issues, which is fine, of course. That's learning. We can go back and correct mistakes. We can redraw, but there's a higher likelihood you're going to have to start over if you don't follow it in the way I'm recommending. So to begin with, I'm just going to be using graphite. And the reason I'm using graphite is because I want to have the lines themselves, the actual container for the drawing. I want it to be precise and sharp, which graphite is great at. And I also want it to be light enough that when I come over it with pen and ink, which is what I'm going to do next, this is a quill. This is just a feather that I've cut to create a quill. I want it to be lighter than that. And it would be nice to have the ability to erase if I need to. I'm going to be using this. This is called a porte-crayon. This is just a holder. So to begin with, let's go ahead and create a rectangle that is 5 parts by 6 parts. When I give measurements, I'm going to give the width first. Here's a parallel bar that I have. I'm using a little mobile drafting board. You could, of course, use a T-square. You could use anything, but it's really nice if you have the ability to get both true horizontals and true verticals. That's useful. It just makes your life a little bit easier. To begin with, at least, I want to create the width of my box, and that width is going to be 5 inches across. I'm thinking ahead to what this entire transformation is going to look like. You don't know what it's going to look like yet, so I do recommend that before you actually draw along with me, you can take notes, but before you actually do this, you probably want to watch the entire thing so that you can get an idea and you can plan your page accordingly. All right. So there is 5 inches. It's nice to actually make the tick marks, and I'll try to keep my head out of the frame, which is a little awkward for measuring. You normally would want to have your head directly above what you're doing. Not only am I making my horizontal line 5 inches across, I'm also adding these little tick marks because it's going to help you make sure that you don't have proportional mistakes. So let's go ahead and bring up, I'm just going to use a triangle here. So this is, again, this has inches, which is convenient because now we need to go 6 inches up. Again, maybe in yours, one part, right, is, 3 centimeters or 1 centimeter or whatever measurement you like. But in my case, it's corresponding to inches. So coming down from 6, and then I'm going to, without getting my head in the way, the best I can, just mark off where these inches are, or where these parts are, in other words. Okay? So obviously with the triangle, the right angle that it creates, make sure that I'm not drawing a skewed box, a parallelogram instead of a box. Because I could just run it straight, but it's more, I might stand up actually to actually see what I'm doing a little bit better without blocking it, hopefully. But because I want these tick marks is why I'm using the scale again here. So this is, actually I only want to go to 5 here. 5, 4, 3, that's 2, and that's 1. Okay, so I actually went one too far, I'll just ignore it. And now I'm going to complete this with my triangle. Six parts. Okay, same thing. I'm going to make little indications. Now I'm not gridding this up completely because I want to be economic with my lines. I don't want to overdo it. Also, it doesn't have to be that exact. We're not going to correspond every little nuance, every little inflection and change of plane to a grid. That's not really the approach here. This is just to get us sort of in the ballpark for this first view. So this is too long. Just disregard this. Let's go ahead and start figuring out how our scapula is going to fit into this rectangle. Now again, it's 5 parts across, 6 parts tall. It's really important. Where I'm going to start is, we could refer to this as the first row, second row, third, fourth, fifth, sixth row, and the first, second, third, fourth, fifth column. So we're basically kind of like an Excel sheet or something. We're sort of counting. We're starting in this top corner and we're counting this way and that way. In my first column is where this point here is where we're going to start to move away. We're going to start to move away from the edge. And so I'm just doing this lightly. Like this is really a planning, and I'm going to hook here. This is really a planning stage. This is not the drawing proper. This is planning the proportions and the dimensions. As we move up from here, you'll notice that the scapula, this is of course the medial margin and the medial border. All of this is the medial border. It's very flat here. We have taken advantage of that. And so I'm just going to treat all of this area, I'm just going to leave the line of the edge of the box here. And then I'm going to start here, which is the third row, first column. This is where it's going to start to break away. And it's going to break away as the scapular spine begins. the scapular spine is probably the most important part of the scapula for our purposes. So it's very important that we get this right. Indicate right there this root, this beginning of the scapular spine. It has a beautiful curve, which we're going to sneak up on. And so we have inflection points. We have points where convexity becomes concavity and concavity becomes convexity. This is the curve that I'm drawing. And I'm going to terminate here in the 5th column and the 1st row. A little bit below that 1st row here. And then I'm going to sort of make contact here in this corner. And again, I'm just keeping this really simple. This is really just the placement of what we're going to use later. Also going to sort of cut off this corner, almost like I'm beveling this corner. And then around here, we're going to start to swoop down. Now, I mean, I always think of a hockey stick when I think of this form. But we can notice here on the top of the scapular spine, we have sort of a reflection of the supraspinous fossa and the infraspinous fossa. Again, it is really interesting and beautiful how this top curve is sort of staggered compared to the lower curve. So that's a pretty good indication. And also we'll notice that there is this sweeping curve, which is the greater scapular notch. This is how nerves and blood vessels pass from the upper fossa into the lower. And here I'm in the 2nd row. So this should be the 4th column of the 2nd row. So now we're coming to the glenoid cavity or the glenoid fossa, which I always sort of think of as a bowl or maybe a shallow dish, like let's say a soy sauce dish or something like that. It is quite shallow. So now we're moving from the head, which is the lateral angle, and let's make our way down to the inferior angle. If we come back down to this 6th row of the 1st column, it's going to flatten out for a bit, but right before this 1st column ends, we're going to come out. And then we're going to hook around, which is this point right here. We're keeping it relatively simple. This might not seem simple, I can appreciate, but for now, we're just trying to get proper placement because we are going to use these measurements essentially in our parallel and our perpendicular projections. Second column, we're in the 1st row here. Close to the midpoint would be the apex. Would be the apex of this curve. This is, of course, the superior angle. And I should mention that it's important to note here that if you're wondering how exactly this glenoid cavity is ending, well, it's being occluded. It's being blocked by the scapular spine here. So we want to imply that this is just continuing to go up. And maybe we can even sort of give it a border to imply that there's this lip. Okay, so we're going to come sort of straight here, and then we're going to dive down at a very straight, almost even concave angle, and then make our contact there. So obviously, like looking at the scapula, you can see how important this structure is. And we can take a minute and just make sure that we're correct here. As simple as this is now, it's really important that we get this right, because let's say, for example, I mean, like right here, I made a mistake. I took this over one too many. If you have something stretched out or out of proportion dramatically at this point, it is going to be a problem. So we want to avoid that being the case. Like we could show this ridge. It would not be a bad idea to indicate that. Just with a line for now. We can indicate this hollow. Imply where it might be going. Again, here is the greater scapular notch. It's sort of a channel. And it's possible that depending on how we let this end and how that overlap happens, we can sort of imply that. Maybe give a little more specific shape there. Of course, on the acromion process, which is the end here, if we think of it sort of as a boxy form, there's going to be the rear plane, which you can clearly see here. And so that might be good to indicate as well. There's a plane here. And then this is moving away from us. And we can even show a little more clarity there. Now this is sort of a depression under here that rounds out. The way that this column is built, it's almost like a tree trunk or something. We'll notice that bones are often like that. So I'm just going to sort of create like a little section here that is going to just give the eye a little bit of an idea of what's going on. And then just a little indication that this is sort of a down plane that we're seeing here. We could also, as you can see here, the rim or the lip of the glenoid is good to indicate. And then we might even indicate that there's a change of plane there. We could show this sort of lip. The next view we're going to be drawing is the lateral view. Of course, as you notice, if we're in an orthographic view, which means we're not getting convergence and perspective distortion, all of the heights are going to remain the same as we transfer across. We can begin with that. So we can actually start by bringing over the bottom of our box. I'm just going to go ahead and run this all the way across, because we're going to use it later. I can use the bottom edge of the parallel bar here. Of course, this could be a straight edge, this could be whatever, a piece of wood, as long as it's straight. This is the parallel transformation. So we're going to carry over some measurements. We sort of used a implied grid here to get us in the right place. Now that we positioned these elements, there are some widths that are going to require some new information that you're going to need from me. So we're going to additionally be using another implied grid. But to start with, let's bring over some of the important points here and bring them across, because they're going to be really useful. So for example, this change of plane here, we can bring that over. We can bring that across. Just going to try to be precise if I can. Just sort of going all the way across the page at the moment. where would another useful point be? Here's another change in plane that we can use. The base of the glenoid. This is the bottom of the glenoid. Now, we can't really see where the top of the glenoid is. It's hidden essentially slightly, but it's around here. What else could be useful for us? If we look at this corner here on the inside, that could be useful. It's the top, the high point of the superior angle. I think that's enough for now. So you could write what these actual landmarks are on the actual line. This is what I'm talking about with parallel transformation. So we know all of these points that we brought horizontals across should line up with our other views here. That being said, we're still going to measure out the box for this lateral view because these two views are sort of what everything else is going to be based on. So we're going to do 6 views. These two are the most important for that. So I can still, I could bring across the inch measurements. I don't want to have too many lines if we can avoid it. That's 6 parts, in my case, 6 inches tall. The horizontal dimension from this view is actually going to be 3 parts wide. In my case, that is 3 inches. In your case, it would be whatever your unit length is. And again, I'm trying to do this without getting my head in the way for you. But you're going to want to have your head like directly over your work as you do your work. And we can do the top as well. It's a little easier if I stand, I think. Okay, sorry about that. I know my head's in the frame. Okay. And these do not have to be absolutely perfect. There is some degree of tolerance. Okay. And I'm going to mark off just within a reasonable tolerance. I'm going to mark off these tick marks. Okay. This is now 3 parts by 6 parts. Once this view is correct, everything else is going to be an extrapolation on that, which you're going to see. Everything you see here, in terms of the level, right, the heights, is going to be the same on this side. Now, from any given view, we can't see everything. So there's things that are obscured. For example, from this view, as I mentioned, we can't see the top of the glenoid fossa. We can only see a little bit of the coracoid process. It's named because it resembles a raven. That's where it gets its name. We're not going to be able to see like what this curvature is, what's going on this side. there's new information. Every new view is going to include new information that we need to know. So there's not enough information here to give us this. Part of that information is the widths from this view, which in a normal situation would be the depth, because the scapula would be something like this if we were looking at the front of the body in the anatomical position. But I'm talking about this dimension here across. So just by giving you that it's 3 across, that's containing this, that's getting us in the ballpark. The way the scapula has been oriented is sort of to keep it in alignment with the box, you know. So we're having the straight here. This is relatively upright, and that's going to help us. So I want to start by doing glenoid cavity. I'm in the third row in the second column, and this is where it is going to terminate on the lower side. And then we're going to get the shape that it actually has is sort of a pear shape. That's probably the best way to think about it. I'm going to come right up here. And so I was saying before, I was sort of giving you a spoiler on where this was going to be. So that's why I'm hitting this measurement here. But in terms of how it relates to this grid, it's just entering the first row up here. So do you see it's a little bit above that tick mark? The reason it's hitting this line is because we put it in from that angle. And then it tends to be a bit either flat or concave here, and then there's a change, and then it swings out to sort of its full hippie, almost like a figure. There is sort of a lip. Now it's very shallow, so don't draw this surface as if it's deep. As we'll learn later, it's actually deepened by what's called the glenoid labrum. This is a very shallow joint. That's why it's so easy to dislocate your shoulder, and we can talk a little bit about the evolutionary reasons for that. And then we got to bring this coracoid out, this raven's head, which is like a bit like a finger or a thumb. And I'm going to bring that to the level of this first tick mark here. And in a way, it's similar to over here, the column or the pillar of the spine of the scapula. We're going to see that nature repeats itself quite a bit in very beautiful and interesting ways. So because of that, we can use things, I mean, Leonardo calls these similes in his study. We can actually compare things we learn from anatomy, from nature, even from unrelated species, unrelated life forms. You'll see these are, you know, this is like an animal's head. This is like the finger. This is like a wing. We'll see these, and these are not purely in our imagination, which would still be useful. This is, and we can see the top of the superior angle is here. It comes off at an angle. We'll talk more about that later, but it's going to be here. It's not just a coincidence. Nature repeats itself. It really does. It's very useful. The more we study nature, the more equipped we are for learning new information about the natural world. You can see here that we're making contact with the side of the box. And I'm drawing the acromion, and then it's coming up and it's making contact up here. I'm drawing this right here. I'm keeping it simple for now. It's at the level of that. This is about the level of that row here, as you can see, this tick mark. Drawing this. This is obviously quite foreshortened. That's this. can see the superior angle. Now, the scapula is very thin. The blade, it's called shoulder blades for a reason. Blade is in thin, sharp. It is quite sharp and quite thin. In fact, you can't tell here, but it is actually transparent and translucent. When you remove the scapula from the body, you can see through it if you shine a light behind it. So, but it is quite thick on the lateral side. This sort of is like a thick bar that is created. And so we're going to sort of flirt with this grid line that we can imagine going down. We're going to imagine where that is, and you could even draw it. This thick bar, this lateral border, or lateral margin, is sort of playing against that straight. It'd be somewhere in here. And it sort of makes its way down, and then it curves back, and then making contact. Pretty straight. It's relatively straight. This is stepping back at an angle here. So we might want to treat this part as like a ledge. Do you see what I'm saying? But the full thickness of this is here. And from this angle, I'm actually not seeing anything further back because this thickness is actually blocking it. And it gets thinner, and then it starts to curve back. Add a few little lines just to show me that I'm stepping back dramatically. This is going back into space. We're going to make out a little bit. Let me try to turn for the camera. We're seeing a little bit of the surface back down here in these lower rows. We're seeing a little bit of that concave side. Okay, and that is our graphite lay-in. Before we progress to additional views, we are going to need to darken the line work that is here. As I mentioned before, I'm using a relatively hard graphite, which is quite light. What we're going to do next is use ink to darken these outlines. I'm going to be using a quill pen for that. If you're working traditionally like me, and if like me you've been using graphite or something hard and relatively light for the drawings so far, then the goal here is just to get darker. So I would recommend pen. It could be a fine liner. It could be ballpoint pen. A fountain pen would be good. Dip pen would be nice. If you want to recreate this material, you can do that as well. The ink that I'm going to be using, I've got two different dilutions here of walnut ink. So this is a brown ink, and this is going to be the lighter. It's just been cut with water a bit more. Let me just go ahead and test out my pen here in the corner in the least disruptive area possible. Just make sure I'm getting a good flow of ink. I'll use a slightly thicker line here. I am just realizing I can maybe tune it just a little bit to get it a little bit finer line than what I'm seeing. So this is a constant tuning. The nice thing about a quill pen is that you can get exactly the shape of the stroke that you like. It's not determined by a manufacturer, and it's continuously tunable. Other things that are nice about a quill are how springy it is. So the feel of it, the responsiveness of it. I'm just taking a moment to look at what we have. And I'm just going to start anywhere, basically. I'm starting with the achromium process. I'm going to be, even though the lines are going to be relatively simple, I want to be very deliberate with them. So at this stage, this is really like my second round. And here we can notice that the acromion process is in front and some of the coracoid process is actually peeking out from behind. So I want to be aware of that. So that rough surface, when we get into the rendering, surfaces tend to be rough whenever strong muscles grab onto them. Bones affect the muscles and muscle affects the bones. Whoops. Gotta be careful. So that rough texture, I might be able to hint at, but overall is probably going to be something that needs to be achieved in the rendering, which we will be doing later. I want to show sort of what that surface is doing a little bit. Just getting it a little bit more specific with the shape of the acromion. In particular, one thing I want to achieve or try to achieve is more of the boxy feeling that we have a top plane that then becomes the lateral and rear plane. I'm just trying to separate that a little bit and using little curved strokes. Using little curved strokes are just one way to suggest that, and I don't want to overdo it. Often it's the case that rather than saying a lot with many lines, we can just be more careful and thoughtful about the lines we put down. I think good drawing has a lot to do with that. So we can't see the top of the glenoid again. I want to model how these forms are turning. And with a quill, you can use the side, you can use it even backwards, you can use the pen in different directions. Allowing a little, the suggestion of a little bit of a shadow. You can start to suggest that this form is tucking around. And usually I want to try to connect the lines as much as I can. This is the lighter layer. I'll be able to come in with the darker layer after that. This lip gets thicker, lower. I'll sometimes dab at my ink. The pen in general is not necessarily a tool for perfect. Anything with the liquid element is not going to be a tool for perfect final lines. You know, this is not an etching. So I'm not going to, so in terms of the drawing technique, I'm allowing some amount of exploration to occur. I'm not too worried about little drops here or there and these kinds of things. Here we're moving down into the glenoid tubercle. Here's this hollow before. That we were talking about. And this is where sort of this ridge we want to show where things are really a plane, even if it's a narrow plane sometimes, rather than a line. Because, of course, lines are abstract, but and so are planes. The more three-dimensional, the more form-driven we can be, the better our result. So the reason this medium tends to be more for sketching is because there's just a little bit of unpredictability. So where I might have just used 2 lines, I'm sort of thinking whether there's a little bit more character I might want to show. And again, you can see as this dries that this is the lighter ink. I am also thinking about gesture, thinking about how the rhythms and the movements of the bone are manifesting themselves. Where does the plane narrow? Where do overlaps happen? The more specifically, the better. Particular, what I'm interested in at the moment is how this plane turns away here, and how we can actually catch a little bit of the shadow side of this sort of roughened area. Paper towel works fine for that. This area would be in shadow under most lighting conditions, and so what I'm trying to do is I want to show that the light's coming from above. I want that to drop into shadow. That is probably going to be best done with some kind of series of lines that then come up and they're making they're creating the shadow just with their existence. The lines are designed to describe the form as much as possible. You know, we want to be as clear as we can, and it's true that a lot of that is about intuition, but a lot of it's about analytical thinking and care and planning. And that's where the facility comes over time, but it's not a purely intuitive approach. You need to think about lines, tones that you make. And sometimes you have to retrain yourself. The intuition needs to be trained. That's really how it gets built. It gets built with experience. And there are times to be loose, or there are times where, you know, it's okay to adopt a more direct hand. I want to show this swelling right here where my thumb is. This is like an egg shape. Get that. I want to imply that. The shape here almost reminds me of the area just under the navel, which is a sort of a bifurcation of an essentially round form. Of course, the shape of that, the form matters. It's not just getting a round form there. It's what is the nature of that round form. So I think at this point I need to be clear about what the spine of the scapula is looks like, is shaped like, is doing. And it's going to be at its sort of most obvious and sharpest here. It's that beautiful curve again that we talked about. But the form is sort of passing into tone away from the light. What I mean is that I'm imagining a light coming from this direction, from above. So this is going to be lighter. This is going to catch a lot of light. The rim of the lateral border is going to catch light. Much of the rest of the scapula is going to some degree at least, fall into tone. So that's what I'm trying to be aware of, my lighting. And I'm not, because of the lighting situation right now with the lights shining down on my pad, the goal is sort of for an even, bright fill for the purposes of recording. So this isn't the most ideal light for lighting the scapula for me to observe it. So I have to actually have more of an ideal lighting situation in mind. Also, being able to touch is helpful for me here. So it's still very simple at this stage. And in some areas, we can even develop a crosshatch, which obviously drops the tone down lower. But it also must describe the surface of the form. That's one of the requirements usually under most situations. I want my lines to follow the forms. For what we're doing here in particular, it's the form analysis that is paramount. So we want to be at our most descriptive. Even if maybe when we're drawing for ourselves, we maybe tend to be a little more expressive or whatever it is. The needs here are about clarity. So imagine that right now we're taking notes on some kind of important map or, list, something we're going to need to refer to, because that is essentially what we're doing. Not just within the duration of this course, but also later on. If all goes well, this drawing you're doing now, and you might just be watching me at this moment and you're going to come back afterwards and do it, but at some point you should be hearing my voice at the appropriate time. It's possible this drawing you're doing now is just one of the drawings that you'll be referring to potentially for the rest of your life and the rest of your career. So try to treat it with that amount of care. We don't want to assume that this is information that we can learn later. Yeah, I know I don't understand the hand. I know I don't understand all of these things, but I'm just gonna learn it later. That's sort of the kind of thing we tell ourselves. And of course, later doesn't always come. And for many of us, it never comes. So your best strategy for success is to do it now. And I can just imagine the meme that accompanies that advice.
Do it!
So the drawing becomes a little more clear. I'm loosening up a little bit more. Maybe I'm taking more risks. That might be a way to think about what's going on. I don't want this form here where my thumb is to feel like it needs to have some kind of character and an idea of how the surfaces are moving. And because it's in the light, or should be in the light, it's a little bit tricky. And so I'm just sort of thinking what I can do. And it's not a solved problem. I think I'm going to need to continue thinking about this, but what can I do to describe the form more clearly? If you can't tell, or if you haven't suspected by now, of course, this course And really, anytime we study anything with the language of drawing, if we are studying diligently, if we are good students, if we are being analytical and careful, then there is a good chance that we're also becoming better at drawing in this case, since drawing is our medium that we were using. And so knowledge is compounding like that, especially with complex skills. Our knowledge in one area helps us in other areas, or can, if we're open to it. So maybe right now, maybe I'm learning a little bit about what I like in trying to describe some of these rough textures, and maybe I'm also learning some things that I don't like that I might want to do differently next time. And in terms of the drawing inspiration for this particular drawing, I'm thinking of Vesalius, who was one of the first anatomists, one of the fathers of anatomy, also an artist. And he, along with Leonardo and others, developed the drawing language that created this field, at the very least, the field of anatomical illustration, but in many ways, anatomy itself. At the time in which Leonardo was doing his dissections and studies, and the Renaissance artists were beginning to take this more naturalistic approach towards anatomical study, Latin textual sources were still the main means of learning. Artists, especially the artists of the Renaissance, invented many of the fields and the disciplines that we associate with the sciences or other areas. And so in this case, I'm thinking of Vesalius's beautiful, clear drawings. I think people today would probably consider a lot of them to be maybe too cartoony for serious study, or maybe the anatomical inaccuracies that we might spot if we've been studying it from a more modern scientific perspective. The things that we notice that are actually wrong about older works can throw us off, because we see one mistake or one thing. Well, maybe this hand looks too big. Maybe it's like the angle of the pelvis or something, and then we sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. And because one aspect of the illustration or the drawing looks a little goofy to our eyes, we don't take it seriously and don't study it. But that is a mistake, I think, because the work of Vesalius and Leonardo and Albinus and others, in my opinion, is some of the best anatomical study ever done. Even though they didn't have x-rays, they were dissecting, but even though they didn't have x-rays and they didn't have MRIs or CT scans and a lot of this technology, they were more skilled as artists. And so they had a more perceptive eye for form. And I am sort of weighting the outline in certain, or beginning to at least, weighting the outline. And that is a technique where you can show where there's a change of plane by making the outline a little bit darker in some areas or thicker. And you can also show an overlap, make that more clear. And you can sort of punctuate and clarify your light source as well. So there's lots of things you can sort of do with the outline and with the weighting of that line. So I think I might need to tune this. You need to tune this quill up because it is starting to. My flow of ink is getting a little bit. I'm going to sort of darken this area in particular to create sort of a darker spot. And I'm going to do the same here. Where less of the reflected light can get up into this area. You can see is that, I mean, also the new layer of ink is of course wetter because it's gone down more recently, but you can see that by diluting the ink, we're creating more of a sense of value. So I'm going to do a few. Some of this is with the intention of sort of showing some of the texture. So what I definitely don't want is I don't want this to read as if it's as light as the light area. So I do need to make sure that even though I want this to be lighter here, because it's getting reflected light, it still needs to be in shadow. And probably here, same thing. And anytime I can sort of connect an existing line, connect a new line to an existing line, that decorative flowing kind of quality can be strengthened. I want to make sure that the actual form reads. So if I look at the drawing, I want to make sure that the forms look like what they really are. So that requires me making a conscious effort, let my mind inform me at what the surface is, and then react to that and correct. I want to emphasize there's a hollow here. I want to emphasize it. And by switching between the more diluted ink and the more my final lines, I'm able to get more of an expressive sort of a range. It's just sort of going back and forth between them. Okay, I'm not done with this, I don't think, but I am going to move to the next view.